We're doing Parsha tonight rather than on Wednesday. Last week we did Nocher's 12 children. I learned so much in preparing the class. I enjoyed teaching the class and so on. So I said, you know what, let me do something else. In this week's Parsha, you have 16 new descendants of Avraham Avinu. Right, Avraham Avinu was married to a woman named Hagar, and they had one son whose name was Yishmael. The Malach told Hagar to name the boy Yishmael, and Avraham gave the boy the same name without Hagar ever telling him. And then, of course, Avraham had another son from a woman named Sara, which he named Yitzchak. We don't know about him, yeah? And then Sara passes away. After Sara passes away, Yitzchak remarries. And after Yitzchak, he gets married for the first time, pardon me. But he wasn't really married. Rivka was all three. When Rivka is brought to Yitzchak goes to find another wife for Avraham. Which is an incredibly remarkable thing. You should know, one of the hardest things, it should never happen to anybody, is to watch someone's parent remarry. And I know of many families where a woman or a man dies relatively young, and the remaining parent marries again, and many times the children are very angry. They're angry at their parent, and they're especially angry at the stranger that either came into their home or married their father or mother shortly after their wedding. They sort of feel like it's an invasion of their space. It's a disrespect to their mother and their father. Rarely do you have children who actually want their parents to get married again because they know how good it is for them. A man came over to me and says, Rabbi, you need to find a wife for my father. I couldn't believe it. His mother passed away very young. I think she was 50. And he was so desperate to find, I think his father is now remarried. But you don't see that a lot. Yitzchak goes to look for a wife for Avraham. Yitzchak, who loved his mother very much. And it was only 3 years after she passed away. She passed away when Yitzchak was 37 years old. When Avraham is 40, he remarries. And he has a bunch of kids. He has 6 more children. And the Rebbe once pointed out that we make such a big deal out of the fact that Avraham Avinu had one son at the age of 100, and there's 6 kids at 140, no one even notices. Who does Yitzchak Avraham Avinu marry? Avraham Avinu marries a woman whose name is Keturah. Rashi says that Keturah is actually Hagar. Why does she have 2 names? Because the Aramaic word, the Hebrew word Keturah, the Aramaic word Keturah is from the word in Hebrew Kesher. Kuf Shin Resh. In Aramaic, a Tes and a Shin change places. Like Ktoires is actually Kshiras with a Shin. Tes and Shin are interchangeable. So Rashi says that Hagar was divorced. Avraham Avinu was forced to kick her out of the house by Sara's behest many years before they got divorced, right? When Yitzchak was a little boy and Yishmael was trying to kill Yitzchak, Sara says, kick him out of the house for the second time. So Hagar was back to Mitzrayim. Since the time Yishmael was kicked out of the house with Hagar, you gotta figure 30 years passed at least. And then one day Yitzchak shows up himself and says, you know what, my father's alone, maybe you come back and live with him. So Rashi says that Hagar, the entire period of time, how many years it was, from the time she left Avraham Avinu's house until Yitzchak came to her and said, maybe you marry my husband and father again, she remained alone. She tied a knot on the entrance to her tent, and basically she said, I lived with a tzaddik, I will not live with any other man. And that's what Keturah means, that she tied a knot on the front of her tent. She was not available, she was alone. And when Yitzchak calls her, she comes, and she marries Avraham Avinu, and of course they have many children together. Keturah has 6 children. 2 of those children's children are also mentioned, and one of those children's children is mentioned. It's a total of 16 names. The 6 sons that Keturah produces are Zimran, Yokshan, Medon, Midian, Yishbak, Shuach. Yokshan has 2 children, Shva and Dedan, and Dedan has 3 children, Ashurim and Tushim Ashurim and Tushim are Avraham Avinu's great-grandchildren. And then another one, Midian, has 5 more children, Ephah, Chanoich, Avida, V'lah, a total of 16 children. So I just want to say that at the outset, the shir is based on my imagination. to a very great extent, more than normal. But the sources that I have a little bit from the Teda Shleima, my go-to source. I also have, the Rishonim were not very helpful. A little bit from Shachal HaTorah. This week, the fellow who was most helpful to me was the Chidah. I don't know if you've heard of the Chidah. Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai. He was one of the great Sfadish Mekubalim, one of the great Sfadish Go'onim. My father-in-law told me something very mind-blowing about the Chidah. That when there was the big machloikus in the Chassidim and the Misnagdim, the Alter Rebbe and the Vilna Gaon, the Alter Rebbe said that he's not afraid to debate the Vilna Gaon in Nigla, he's not afraid to the Vilna Gaon in Kabbalah. And the Alter Rebbe said, if we are going to ever meet and resolve our differences, we're going to need a judge, we're going to need a referee. And the Alter Rebbe writes, we're going to have to take someone from the Sfardim to referee between me and the Vilna Gaon. So my father told me, I'm assuming he heard from his father, Reb Nissen, that the Alter Rebbe was referring to the Chidah. To see a Yid should stand between the Vilna Gaon and the Alter Rebbe, you can only imagine what kind of Gaon he was. The Chidah wrote more Sfarim than almost any God will be sold ever. He has, 40, 50 Sfarim, incredible Sfarim in the whole Torah. And someone was malakit from all of his Sfarim, a Pirush HaChumash. It's a lot of Kabbalah, it's fantastic. He's one of those people, just very interesting. In a later generation, there was one of the great Sfadim Gedolim, probably the last greatest of the great Sfadim Gedolim was a Yid by the name of the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad. He also wrote Anashir Sfarim. So many Sfarim, interesting Sfarim. So the Chidah, it's not his sefer. He didn't make a Pirush HaChumash. Someone's malakit, and he has a lot of nice, sweet things to say about the Keturah's children. The underlying question is, why did Avraham get married again? And more importantly, this may sound like a funny question, but why did Avraham Avinu have more children? And I'll explain the question to you mystically, api Kabbalah. There's a concept in Kabbalah based on a medrash that says Yotza Mimenu. Everything holy has a klipa, and the klipa has to get out. Has to get it out. If the klipa doesn't get out of the way, it ends up where it's not supposed to. It ends up in your children. So that's the explanation of api Kabbalah. Before Yitzchak was born, Yishmael had to be born. Yishmael is Chesed. He's like Avraham Avinu, but he's the klipa of Avraham Yotza Mimenu. And the same is true with Yitzchak. Yitzchak has two children, Esav and Yaakov. Esav is the category of Yotza Mimenu. Esav comes out of Yaakov Avinu. Esav comes out of Yitzchak Avinu. You're rid of the Klipa, and then you can have Kedusha. So the Shaila de Mekubala Mass that the Mefarshim ask is, Yitzchak was already born. So whatever Klipa Avraham needs to get out of his system, you hope he already did get out of his system, because if he didn't, it was too late. What would be the mystical reason why Avraham Avinu got married and have a bunch of kids who were goyim? That shows that there's a very interesting thing about Bnei Keturah. Bnei Keturah are different than Yishmael, because Yishmael was circumcised. But according to Jewish law, Yishmael's children do not need a bris. But Keturah's children do. There's a big shaila, why are goyim allowed to do a bris? Because bris is a covenant, a goy is not allowed to do any mitzvah, which is a covenant of the Jewish people. And the answer that's brought is not Yishmael, it's Keturah. Keturah's children were born after Yitzchak. And anybody born after Yitzchak needed a bris. And because Keturah's children were goyim with a bris, we allow goyim to make a bris milah. She has 6 kids. So the shaila is, why would Avraham bring 6 more children in the world that are from Klipa if Yitzchak is already born? And there's 2 approaches. There's 3 or 4 different answers, but there's 2 basic approaches. One is that these 6 kids were really bad guys. I mean, like the worst of the worst. They were terrible. They were Avodah Zarah. They were Klipa at the worst. One of them, the Gebal says, in the Arizal alone, there's 2 paragraphs in the Sefer Kut and Arizal. One says they were not bad, nice guys. The other guy says they were terrible. And that Avraham Avinu had these 6 children because they were from Gvura. They're from Gvura. And because they were from Gvura, they should have been Yitzchak's children, because Yitzchak is Gvura. But if Yitzchak would have brought these 6 kids into the world, it would have been Gevura times Gevura. It would have been so terrible, they would have destroyed the world. So Avraham volunteered to have children that were Yitzchak's birur. Because if Yitzchak had done this birur himself, those 6 children would have been such a severe, such a terrible klipa, it would have been very, very destructive. So Avraham's children, after Yitzchak is born, are him doing a birur for Yitzchak's neshama, so that eventually Yaakov Avinu could born, which means that these guys were worse than Esav. Yitzchak had Esav, and that was okay. But these 6 children, if Yitzchak gave more to these 6 children that represent such a severe gvura, it would have been really, really terrible. Another thing I saw is that this was a birur of Avraham for Yaakov's sake. that in order that Avraham Avinu Yitzchak was already born, so you have to assume that whatever schmutz Avraham had in himself, he had already gotten out before the birth of Yitzchak. But for some reason, in order for Yaakov to be as perfect as he was going to be, Avraham had to get out some more klipa from himself, so that even though Yitzchak was already separate from him, when Yitzchak would conceive Yaakov Avinu, it would be more pure. So there's a number of different positions in Kabbalah, in Svarim, that describe these children of Keturah as being really, really severe evil. Gvura Shabbat, the worst evil. And Avraham was mevara them, even though it was not his direct business. Now, I want to explain something to you about Gvura. There's a maimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe, from Rosh Masim Kippur Tavshin Vav, which is based on the Ayin Beis, really, where the Rebbe Ayatz, where the Frierdiker Rebbe talks about a Zohar, which talks about Gvura. And I have to do this quick because I have very limited time. The Zohar says that the head of Esav is at the feet of Yitzchak. You know the story when Yaakov Avinu passed away, they didn't want to let him bury him, so Chushim Dan chopped off Esav's head and it rolled into Baras Machpelah. It ended up at Yitzchak's feet and they left it there. Esav's head at the feet of Reisha, the Esav Batfui the Yitzchak, the Zohar. So the previous Rebbe has a maimer, which is a very psychological maimer. We explained what this means. He says Yitzchak was Gvura. Gvura is not bad. Gvura is just very critical. Now, is being critical a good thing or a bad thing?
You're on the receiving end now.
Either or the giving end. If the person can take it, then it's good. If the person can't take it, then it's cruel. We, as a generation, are extraordinarily sensitive, and we're the worst for it. If I, Yossi Paltiel, from the time I was a young man, was capable of taking criticism, I would be a much bigger person than I am. It's a fact. I'm very sensitive. I don't like to be criticized. And it's a big chesed. Yitzchak was very critical with himself. And that's why Yitzchak became the giant that he was. And Yitzchak's criticisms was all focused on making himself better. Esav was his son. So the Rebbe Ayatz does in this Maimid is, he says there's levels of Gevura. One person is critical because he wants to help you. Another person is critical, he wants to help you, but he also gets pleasure from finding your faults. And it goes through like a chain. The third person doesn't care about you so much, he just cares about being able to criticize you. And the end of the chain is what he calls Gvuras Kashas. Some people just love to watch people suffer. And the meaning of the head of Esav at the feet of Yitzchak is Gevura. When it trickles down from level to level, it goes from criticizing for the right reasons, for criticizing for the right reasons and enjoying it, for criticizing and enjoying it too much, to criticizing for the wrong reasons, to bloodlust. Esav is called, he loves to watch people suffer. So Gevura is not bad. But the end of Gevura is Churban. The end of Gevura is destruction. The world cannot exist in Gevura alone, even though Kabbalistically Gevura is a higher source than Chesed, because it becomes very, very severe. These 6 children, these 16 kids, 6 children and so many grandchildren and a few great-grandchildren, according to that position in Kabbalah, which the Arizal brings, and the Chidah brings, according to the position that they were a severe evil, Avraham had to fix them, because if Yitzchak had fixed them, it would have destroyed the world. This is one position. Why did Avraham have 6 children? Because there were birurim that were really not his, let's put it that way, they were Yitzchak's. Avraham volunteered to do it because Avraham was chesed, and the fact that the Gevura came from him and not from Yitzchak made the Gevura a little less severe, a little less benign, a little more benign. This is one approach. But there's another approach also found in the Kisvei Arizal, which is exactly the opposite. And that says that the word Keturah means kesher, a knot with Hashem. And that these children of Avraham Avinu, these 6 children and 5 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren, as it were, or whatever the numbers are, were Gvura in a very sublime way. In other words, they were not bad. They were critical, but in a very positive way. And that these children, when Mashiach comes, are going to become supportive of Yidden. They become servants to the Jewish people. Meaning, like you have a concept in Kabbalah, you may be familiar with this concept in Kabbalah, a peel, a klipa, a peel covers over a fruit. So you take it off and you throw it away. Before the original sin, a peel doesn't cover over a fruit, it protects a fruit. So there's a klipa which is covering over the fruit, and there's a klipa which is protecting the fruit. According to the second version of the story of why Avraham marries Keturah and all of these children, that these children were incredibly refined. They were klipa, but they were very refined. And that when Mashiach comes, they're going to be on the side of Kedusha. So basically what you have is 16 names. 16 names that we need to interpret in two different approaches. Approach number one, that Keturah produces kids from Avraham Avinu that are like really bad. So bad that if Yitzchak has these kids, it'll be Gevurah times Gevurah, it'll blow up the world. So Avraham, so to speak, has volunteered to bring them into the world. That's one model. And the other model of these kids are so good, they're virtual Kedusha, and when Mashiach comes, they're going to be Shemer Zapeh, they're going to protect Kedusha itself. Now, both of these interpretations can be found in the word Keturah. If you bear in mind that Keturah, Kuf Tes Reish Tov, which is exactly the same word as Cowardice, which is a very important thing in the Beis HaMikdash, in Hebrew is Kesher, Kuf Shin Reish, because the Tes and the Shin are interchangeable. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that you probably don't know the answer. What is the biblical term for a coup d'etat? What is the biblical term for the government overthrowing a king? The biblical term, the Tanakh term. Vayikshar Kesher. Tying a knot. In other words, creating intrigue. In Tanakh, there's a lot of cases of there was a king who served for 7 days. He killed the king before him, took over in 1 week. So I once learned Malachim. It's very depressing. It's so depressing because there's killing and dying and don't ask. But the word for a coup d'etat, that means for a government overthrowing its own king from within, is Vayikshar Kesher. So if you're going to assume that Avraham marries Keturah because some really bad klipas need to get out, and Avraham says it's better I get them out than Yitzchak get them out, so then Keturah means Kesher, we're going to assume that we're going to associate it with the idea of revolution, of destroying an establishment and replacing it with another one, of trouble. Alternatively, if you're going to go in the model that Keturah's children are so pure, they're as close to Kedusha as they can be without being Kedusha itself, and the Mashiach comes, they're going to be support of the Jewish people, then we're going to interpret Keturah the way Rashi does. Keturah means a kesher, a knot. That Keturah was a woman who represents a knot that ties together what is naturally not holy with Hashem. So this becomes our class. I presented you almost everything I told you until now says in a sefer, except the one detail that I made up is to translate Keturah from the word coup d'etat. I made that connection. Otherwise, every single thing I said until this point says either in the Arizal or in the Chidah or in the Shach or in the Midrashim. I didn't make anything up. So I went through the names of Avram's 16 children and grandchildren from Keturah, and I was hoping that someone would be kind enough to give me information. And I found that it was worse than last week. If I had not enough data last week when we did Nocher's children, this week I had even less. Okay, I'm going to read all 16 names. The first one's name is Zimron, which sounds like song, Zemer, right? The second one is Yokshan, which sounds like an action, right? Midon is the third, Midyan is the fourth, Yishbak is the fifth, Shuach is the sixth. Those are Keturah's children. Then you have Shava, Dedon, which are Keturah's grandchildren, Ashurim, Utushim, Umim, Keturah's great-grandchildren, and then you have 5 more, Ephah, Efer, Chanoich, Avida, Eldad, that are again Keturah's grandchildren. So there's a mention of 3 great-grandchildren, and I guess 8 grandchildren. There are 6 children, 3 great-grandchildren, and 7 grandchildren. The title lists these 16 names because, Rashi said, the Mefarshim say, if you list 16, why don't you list 50? Why do you only list these? And Rashi already says, the Mefarshim all hold that these 16 people became the fathers of nations. In other words, these 16 names, Zimran and Yokshan and Medan and Midyan, Yishbak, Shuach, and then after that you got Shava and Dedon and Ashurim, Utushim, Le'uvim, Ephah, Chanech, Avida, Eldad. These 16 people were the fathers of nations, and their names are mentioned because if we knew the ancient world, we would know who they were and where they lived. And again, I want to throw something in, another one of my favorite things, wherever Kasha's grandson is, if you're here. Another thing that I like to look at, which is very controversial, is Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who passed away about 40 years ago, has a chumash. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan was a genius. And he did a lot of very great work in translations. He translated a lot of Sfarim, especially the Mamloyas and other things. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan has a chumash, which is called the Living Torah. Teres Chayei, he calls it. In his chumash, he does things that a lot of people would not do, and some people would question the correctness of it, but he had breitkeit, he had boldness. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan looked at the Septuagint. You know what the Septuagint is? Septuagint is called the Targum Shivim, the Greek translation of the Tanakh that was done in the times of the second Beis Hamikdash. We have a Targum Onkelos, right? Targum Onkelos was done in the time of Elazar ben Yeshua after the Churban. We have an earlier Targum called Yenis ben Uziel. Yenis ben Uziel was 100 years before Onkelos. Targum Shivim may have been 200 or 300 years before that. The oldest translation of the Torah into a foreign language is not the Targum Onkelos, it's not the Targum Yenis ben Uziel, it's the Targum Shivim, which we don't trust because the Egyptian kings of the Ptolemean kings of Egypt, who were Hellenists, they were Greek in culture, forced the Jews to make a Targum. I'm sure you know the stories. There's different stories. One story that took 70 rabbis, another story that took 5 rabbis, another that took 3 rabbis. This assumption happened more than once. They took a bunch of rabbis, they put them in different rooms, gave them pens and papers, and said, translate the Tanakh. And they had no communication. The reason they did this was because if one rabbi is going to mistranslate, the other rabbi is going to show him up. So in one version, it pushed 70 chacham, it's man bayisheni. In another version, it says 5. In another version, it says 3. The story happened more than once, apparently. And they put them in different rooms, and the rabbis had a problem. Because there are things in the Tanakh that are offensive, especially to Greek culture. Like the queen or the king of one of the great kings, his wife's name was Arnevis. Arnevis is a teifa animal. And Arnevis is probably a hyrax, but we can talk about that at a different time. Arnevis is probably a rabbit, a shafan is a hyrax. And what happened was all 70 chachamim mistranslated the same way. It was like a magic. They all knew which words they couldn't translate the way it was originally, and there's a Gemara that lists all the words that they mistranslated, and they all did it the same way, so the Greeks wouldn't know. That Targum exists. The original Septuagint, the Targum exists. And Aryeh Kaplan, when he's translated the Chumash, and I talked about this last year, when he does the 70 names, the Pashas Noach, you have 70 names, you know that. In Pashas Noach, 3 weeks ago, you have 70 names. Those 70 names are presumed to be the 70 nations. Aryeh Kaplan tells you which ones they are. When you read it in Hebrew, it doesn't mean anything. Huh?
What 70 nations?
In Pashas Noach, Shem, Cham, and Yafet, it says the names of their kids. It's exactly 70 names. And those 70 names are 70 nations, the Shiva Mumis. But we don't know what they are today because these are ancient biblical terms. The Targum, Yenis, and Targum Onkelos are not helpful. They just say the word in Aramaic. They take the Hebrew and Aramaic. But the Targum Shivim, the Greek translation, tells you what they are. And Rabbi Kaplan, in his Chumash, brings those Greek words. Now, I didn't look it up, but I'm sure that in our Pasha, in Chayei Sara, he doesn't just say the 16 names of Avram's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren from Keturah. He probably tells you which nations they are. I didn't look. I'm just assuming. But it's a pretty reasonable assumption that Targum Shivim doesn't just say just take the Hebrew words and make them into Greek. I didn't look. But these 16 people are not people. They're nations. From Avraham Avinu's older years, he was 140 years old, they got married again, he had 6 children, those 6 children had a bunch of kids. Some of those kids had kids of their own that are all mentioned by name in the Chumash because they represent 16 nations. So here's what I got, okay? A lot of what I'm going to tell you now says, a lot of what I'm going to tell you now, I just made up, bold-faced made it up without any sources. Some of it is like a little in the middle, okay? I want to go through all 16 names in order twice. The first thing I want to do is let's assume that Avraham marries Keturah for the worst reason. That Keturah is a woman, Avraham marries her, and in that marriage they produce children that represent Gvura. That if Yitzchak had produced those kids, they would have destroyed the world because they represent Gvura and Chorban. By Avraham, who's Chesed, having those kids, so they're not so bad. And it was a bidur of severe Ra. And again, you could apply this also to the other Pirush that says that Avraham had these more children to effect that Yaakov would be born from Yitzchak more perfectly. I think those two things are aligned. I'm going through all 60 names, based on the assumption that these kids were bad. Okay? So we start from the beginning. Yakshan, the first one's name is Zimron. It says Medrashim. Zimron means he sang music to Avodah Zarah. In Parshas Bereishis, there's a guy named Cain. Cain was a big troublemaker. His family was wiped out. But amongst his family members was a guy named Yuval and a guy named Yovel. Yuval is the father of music. He must have been a genius of geniuses. He would have made Mozart look like a child. He invented music and the musical instrument. You're talking now 2,000 years later. Yuval died before the Mabul. Avraham Avinu had a son whose name was Zimran, who was a genius in music, but he used his music for idolatry. He used his music for Avodah Zarah. That's the oldest of Avraham Avinu's children. Number two, he has a son named Yokshan. Everybody says that Yokshan was a tough guy. He had a very, very hard character. He wasn't pleasant. He was a very, very hard man. Tough man. And his hardness was expressed in paganism, in his idol worship, in his almost stubbornness about being bad. He was bad to the point where even if you don't understand why he was being bad, he was stubborn. The third son's name is Medon. Medon means a fighter. Medon means really an arguer. Medon means a guy who argues about anything. He sees two people sitting in a room. He goes up to them and says, "What's your name?" "My name is Moshe." "What do you do for a living?" "Kach v'kach." "What do you think about the weather?" He said, "Well, it's hot to go." In 2 seconds, he's arguing with you. Some people just need to argue. They just need to make a mess out of every situation. I call them the hyenas of the world. They just need to make trouble. Amalek and Midon have a similar character. If they watch people getting along, it makes them uncomfortable. They need to stir the pot. Midon is an arguer for no reason other than to argue. And by the way, I got today 3 or 4 different requests. Today is the birthday of the Rebbe Rashab Chof Mar Cheshvan in Tovshin Memches, which is 35 years ago. The Rebbe gave me personally, along with everybody else, a kuntis heicholzu. And when the Rebbe handed the kuntis to each one, including myself, the Rebbe said to me, "Ahatzlocha dikan learning," which means a successful learning. The kuntis heicholzu was about midyan, about people who make fights for no particular reason other than they Pasha cannot stand and people get along. Midon means an agitator, a troublemaker for the sake of it. So if we're going to look at Avram's marriage to Keturah, to expel, to get out, expunge bad klipa, Midon is just a troublemaker.
I don't agree.
Thank you very much for the argument. Thank you. Just an example. He just a case in point. It's a miracle that I actually got the joke for a change. That's beyond my pay grade. The fourth son is Midyan. Midyan is understood to mean that he's very judging. He's very judging. He's very exact. And if we're going to go with the approach that Keturah and Avram produced bad kids, his judgment was a judgmentalism that bordered on cruelty. In other words, he judged himself and others in a way that it wasn't just trying to find exactitude and self-improvement. It was judging to hurt people because he had the Esav characteristic of ultimately enjoying other people's suffrage. The fifth son, his name is Yishbak, and this I made up totally. I have absolutely no source. If you know Tanya, you learned Chitas in the last couple of weeks. The word shavak, shin beis kuf, means to abandon, to forsake, to let go. Like when a person passes away, you say shavak chaim l'chol chai, to leave. So Yishbak, I'm going to say, is to leave behind with a yud. And the connotation of Yishbak would mean, we're going to say he was a guy who couldn't get along with anybody. Couldn't get along with anybody. And as a result of that, he abandoned civilization. He wouldn't live with people, not because he was somehow better, but because he cannot get along with anybody. Wherever he goes, he's fighting, so he abandons communities. Then there's a guy named Shuach. Shuach can mean one of 2 things. Shuach can either mean someone who bends his head, and Shuach means someone who doesn't stop talking. Okay? So we're going to translate Shuach. Shuach is a yente, he doesn't stop to talk. But Shuach is also a coward. That's what bending your head means. Shuach is a coward. Any principle he has, at the slightest sign of aggression, at the slightest sign of opposition, he bends. Even if he believes in something, the minute someone comes along and argues with him, Shuach bends. He has no courage, he has no principle, he has no strength. The minute somebody comes along, so he talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. Berkowitz says to him, "I don't agree," and Shuach falls to the ground. "Oh, he's finished. What happened to all your opinions?" I changed my mind. Okay? Now, Then there's Shva, Shin Beis Aleph. I could find nothing on Shva. I was so desperate I actually Googled. I looked at all these Hebrew sites. Nobody was helpful. Which Shva is, you know the story, Queen of Sheba? In Hebrew, it's Shva. There's a kingdom in East Africa, which presumed to be Ethiopia. And Ethiopians claim that they're descendants of Shlomo HaMelech from Malchus Shva. And if you've ever seen Ethiopians, our African experts will tell us later, they don't look African. But Africans have dark skin, but they also have different noses and different lips. Ethiopians have very, very dark skin, but they have Semitic faces. They look like Jews. And I know people who visited Ethiopia, it's a very strange place. You feel like you're in a Jewish country. They're Christians. They don't eat pig. They have a lot of things which are very interesting about them. And they claim to be descendants of the marriage of Shlomo HaMelech and Malchus Shva got married. Shlomo had 1,000 wives. One of them was Malchus Shva. She is considered in Tanakh and in Chassidus the counterpart of Shlomo HaMelech. And if we're going to go in the way that Keturah was this bad woman, who together with Avraham Avinu is expunging from Kedusha the most severe evil, we're going to have to say that Malchus Shva represents Chochmah that's as bad as Shlomo HaMelech's Chochmah was good. You have to say that. Now, the 8th child, and we're on to the grandchildren now, his name is Didon, Daled Nun, and it reminded me of a Gemara, that the Gemara says, that if you ever meet a man who, on every issue, let's go to the Rav. I once met a man, I know him, I met a man years and years ago. It's a very, very big problem to tell me things, because unfortunately, I'm very likely to remember. I met a man many years ago, who was divorced and remarried. And he was telling me what happened. He got married to this girl. He was very frum, you know. Whenever they argued, he said, let's go to the Rav. Went to the Rav. And his wife, what's up to the Rav? Let's talk. No, we're going to the Rav. Every stupidity ran to the Rav. And then the story says, you know, his wife said, you go to the Rav alone, I'm moving out. He regretted it. Some people, everything is a court case. Let's judge. The Gemara says in Masechet Pesachim that any person who's always saying, Don Yad Name, who's always, let's go to the judge, Kamashma Midon Ka'asi has a character of judgment. So did Don doesn't mean someone who's judging. The Don is who's always looking for a court case, always looking for somebody, a referee. The smallest difference with you, he has to get, you can't leave it alone, you can't compromise, you have to right away get a third party involved. That's how I'm translating the Don. And again, we're going to assume the same thing. If we're going in the Oifen, that Avraham Avinu marries Keturah to expunge, to get out of his system, the worst kind of Ra. This is a person who's always running to a judge, make a court case, because he's trying to make trouble. You know, in America, I don't have to tell you this, you know this. The Americans have made the court system into a terrible, terrible thing. We, United States of America, the citizens of America, have made our courts into something which we are going to live to regret. First of all, we have no law except for the court. I don't have to be moral. I have to just be found not guilty. The idea of right and wrong is very, very lost on our civilization. But litigation, the whole idea is you can sue somebody, you know. A person went to a store and he got a hot cup of coffee and he got burnt. The coffee was too hot, there was no warning on it, and you sue this company and the government gives them millions of dollars. Ridiculous things. That's a person who's always litigating. That's this guy Didon. He's a troublemaker using the court system for his purposes. Now, Rabbi Tzedek, wherever you are, my half an hour is up, you have to reset the phone. The next is a great-grandson of Keturah and Avram. His name is Ashurim. Ashurim means a peddler, someone who travels around a lot, and he knows roads, he knows pathways, he knows roads, he's traveling a lot. And again, if we're going to go in the negative side, we're going to say that Ashurim is somebody who travels a lot to either bring bad from one place to another or to look for all the trouble he can get himself into. Then there's Lutushim, Lamed Tes, Vav Shin Yud Mem, and again it actually points out this is the name of a nation, not just the name of a person. Lutushim is from the word Leitish Barzel. In Bereshis, in Genesis, I mentioned to you before, Cain has two children, Tuval Cain has two kids. One's name is Yovel, one's name is Yuval. One makes music, another makes agriculture. He had a third son whose expertise was metallurgy. He was one of the earliest people to melt metals down to create weapons of war. Litushim, Leitish, Nachayishus Abazel was the same thing. Litushim is 1,500 years after this guy, after Cain's grandson. He does the same thing. He dedicates his life to using metallurgy to create weapons of war. That's Latush. And the last is Lu'umim. Lu'umim means a nation which is made up of many, many nations. A kingdom which is made up of many, many people. When a kingdom, many, many people, it's a big mishmash. If I had more time, I would give you a more inventive insight, but all of this is completely concocted. I made all of this up myself, so we're going to move to the next one. Now, what remains is 5 more great-grandchildren of Avraham and Keturah, and on these 5, there is a chidah. And the chidah paints them as mamish, so holy. So I have to use what the chidah says, but I have to go the other way in the meantime. Okay? We're going in the first path that we're assuming is that Avraham marries Keturah to expunge out of Kedusha the worst kind of evil. So we translate Ephah, and I'm not sure exactly how this works, but it says Ephah means double. Everything is double. Everything is repeated many, many times. And he suggests that Ephah means a person whose involvement in the world is such that he can never get enough of it. As much Gashmis as he has, he wants to have more, and the Chidah suggests that a person who's pursuing Gashmis in that way, the Chazal say, you'll never, if you pursue materialism, you'll always end up wanting something else. It's like drugs. The more you take, the more numb you become to it, the more you need until it kills you. So Ephah means repetition of involvement in Gashmis. Efer Aleph Peiresh means ash. And he connects it to Anoich off of Avraham Avinu. Now, what could be wrong with ash? It's very similar to how I translated Shuach. Ephar means a person who treats himself like garbage. Ash, a human being who treats himself like a scoop on a desk, like a doormat, step on me. That's not Kedusha. That sense of what we call low self-esteem, extreme low self-esteem, where you let people step all over you, is not humility. It's not humility, it's cowardice. It comes from weakness. It comes from refusal to stand up for yourself. And it's evil. It's not a good thing. So one of the 16 children of Avraham Avinu from Keturah, going in the approach that these kids were brought to expunge all kinds of midas rice, I'm translating Ephah as somebody whose self-identity is terrible self-esteem. Then there's Chanoich. Chanoich means education. Right? You can raise a child. But you can use education to raise a child for very destructive purposes. You can raise a child to be afraid of the world. You can raise a child to, I heard once an expose on Rockefeller. Rockefeller was a billionaire. Rockefeller's father was a professional thief. And whenever he would travel and come home, he would lie to Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York. He would lie to him, he would cheat him, he'd show him John Rockefeller. He would show him how stupid he was and how easy he is to trick. And he would cry, and his wife would say, "Why are you doing this?" And he would say, "No one is ever going to fool my son." And that's how he grew up. He grew up to be very sharp, but he wasn't sharpness for integrity, it was sharpness to one-up you rather than to one-up him. That's an education. It's just not a very optimum education. Then you have Avida. Avida means to know God. Avi means Av, father, Da means to know. Da Zalke Avicha. So Avida, if we're going to go on the side of negative, means to know God, to rebel against Him. And the last one is El Da'a, which means to know God. Again, the same idea that the way I wrote it on my note, El Da'a means he finds a way of showing how in God there's more than one opinion. And the reason there's more than one opinion in God, because God is split, which is a form of klipa. So I just went through all 16 children. I'm going to repeat all 16 sons of Keturah but Avraham, but we're going on a different approach. That even though they're klipa, they're very close to Kedusha. They're not klipa which is mechas alapei, they're klipa which hides the fruit, which is the Kedusha, but it's klipa which is a shemeres apei, that protects the fruit. And it says in the Chidah, and one of the opinions that Yisrael means the same thing, when Mashiach comes, they're going to be in support of the Jewish people. So I'm going over the same list a second time, but in a very, very different way. The first son's name is Zimran. He invented music. But music is a wonderful thing. Music can be used for all kinds of purposes. Music is a tool to get yourself closer to the Eibishter. Music is a tool of refinement. So if you're going to see Keturah's children as very special, he invented music for the best of purposes. The second son is Yokshem. He's still hard. Yokshem means a tough, hard guy. But that toughness and that hardness could be used to stand by your principles that are righteous, that are good. The third son's name is Midon. Midon means to argue and fight. And Rabbi Berkowitz, in this case, we're going to interpret Midon, someone who's not afraid to take on anybody else if he feels like the purposes of righteousness are not being served. The fourth one's name is Midyon. Midyon means he's very, very judging. Very, very judging. But this the Chidah says. The Chidah says that Midyon means a person who judges his life, who judges the world, and judges history. And he learns, Midyon does a judgment of the world and history. He says, Gashmis is very important. Too much Gashmis is going to eat me up alive. So Midyon means a person who uses judgment, but he uses the judgment on himself. And he uses the judgment to determine how much Gashmias is good and how much Gashmias is too much. And he raises his kids that way, as we're going to see later. The fifth son is Yishbak. Yishbak leaves the civilization. It says in Rambam from the Gemara that if you live in a community of bad people, go away from them and go live in the desert. So the second version of Yishbak, he also goes away from people, but not he's going away from people who can't get along with people, he's going away from people because he finds the people around to be not righteous enough, he doesn't want to be amongst them. The sixth is Shuach, and Shuach now means he bows to God. Not he bows as a coward, he bows to God. And when need be, he opens up his mouth and he speaks to support Hashem's interest. The seventh son is Sheva, and now we're going to spin it the other way. Malka Sheva was the Chochma of the... Malka Sheva, the queen of Sheba, is equal numbers of Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo is smart in Kedusha, she's smart in Klippa. But Malka Sheva comes to Yerushalayim. And Shlomo marries her, which means Shlomo was Magayed her. Shlomo takes her Chochma and incorporates it into his Chochma. So the flip side of the queen of Sheba is that the Chochma of Sheva, which by itself is Klippa, is fine enough to be incorporated into Kedusha. Now the eighth son, his name is Didon. He's the guy who's always running to court. He's a litigious. He's always litigating. So again, here we're going to interpret Don, who's always judging, always going to court. He's going to court to show fine chesreinis, fine flaws, and to try and correct them. The ninth son is Ashurim. Ashurim means he's a peddler. He travels. He knows the roads. And now we're going to interpret, Api Kabbalah, one of the concepts of being a merchant, a buyer, and a seller is Avedas Habirurim, to elevate sparks. So Ashurim becomes a journeyer for the sake of finding and elevating sparks. Letushim, according to the second interpretation, and this I didn't make up, this actually says in Medrash, is that he was a nomad. He lived in tents and moved from place to place, very, very similar to Cain's son Yovel in Bereshis. If you live in one place and you use up all the land becomes a desert. So they figured out a long time ago that if you travel around, so the land gets a chance to recover, and then you can use it sustainably. So Letushim, that was his thing. He used land in such a way that it would be sustainable. So he lived close to nature in a way that he respected nature. Lu'umim, I looked this up also. I found this in some sefer. I found this in Chassidus actually. Lu'umim means nations, goyim. But there's lu'umim and then there's amim. The difference between amim and lu'umim is the idea in the nations of the world, which is called Yud Aleph Sheba Klipa. I don't have time to explain it. It's the point where Kedusha and Klipa are connected. So lu'umim represents the point of meeting between Kedusha and Klipa. Eifa means to repeat twice, but now you're repeating twice to judge. You know, there's an expression in English, right? Measure twice and cut once rather than measure once and cut twice. Be careful, right? In life, in the world, when you have to make decisions, think about it 2 times. You make a good decision, and it'll be a constructive decision rather than a destructive decision. Afer, which means ash, in this case, means ash is, right, before we told it low self-esteem. Now we're going to call it humility in front of Hashem. Chanoich means to raise your child. And the Chidah speaks a lot about Chanoich. He says, Chanoich, when you raise a child, you let him grow into it slowly. So, which son was it? Midyon. Midyon has 5 children. They're great-grandchildren, or the grandchildren of Avraham and Keturah. Chanoich means he raises them in such a way where he gives them a chance to mature slowly in the ways of righteousness. Avida means Avida, Das Alakei Avicha, know the God of thy father. Vavdei B'leiv of Shalom, serve him with your whole heart. So Midian was one of Avraham Avinu's children, brought 5 children into the world who are 5 different nations, and he taught about the importance of understanding God. And the last one was Elda'a. Again, Elda'a means El Deya, to know the Eibishter. But the way it's interpreted in the Mefarshim is that he taught his children to know Hashem with a sincerity rather than with a cynicism. So, it's 9 o'clock exactly. This class is going on for 50 minutes and 32 seconds. I went quickly, but I gave you a good introduction. I presented you 2 versions of the marriage of Keturah and Avraham Avinu, and I gave you 2 different explanations for each one of the 16 names found in the Chumash. Don't take this too seriously, but it is interesting. Might have.